Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we take a calm but unflinching look at a critical moment in the Ukraine conflict, a moment where political power in Kiev is fracturing, diplomatic pressures are intensifying, and battlefield realities are reshaping everything behind the scenes. What you are about to hear is not speculation or slogans, but a careful examination of events unfolding right now. The forced resignation of Andre Yermach, the unraveling of President Zelensky's inner circle, the shifting strategy in Washington, and Europe's growing financial panic. As Russia advances and Western support shows signs of fatigue, the balance of this war in Ukraine's political future may be entering its final and most consequential phase. Let's begin. Over the last 24 hours, the political crisis in Kiev has entered a new and more dangerous phase with the forced resignation of Andre Yermach. Until now, the all-powerful chief of staff to President Zelensky and the figure many regarded as the real center of power in Ukraine. The sequence of events began with the publication of a long article Yermach gave to Simon Schuster for The Atlantic, in which he repeated the familiar, uncompromising line of the Zelensky government, backed by its European allies, on the war with Russia and on proposals for negotiations and a peace settlement. According to speculation in Kiev and beyond, this interview angered officials in Washington, President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and others in the new administration, who are increasingly focused on engineering an end to the conflict on terms acceptable to the United States and Russia. It is widely assumed that some signal was sent to NABU and SAPO, the two Western-funded anti-corruption agencies in Kiev, and that their investigators responded by raiding Yermach's house, seizing documents and other materials, and thereby triggering a chain of events that culminated in Zelensky accepting Yermach's resignation. Yermach has issued a defiant statement insisting that he is an honest man, that all allegations against him are false, and that he intends to continue serving Ukraine by joining the military and going to fight at the front. Whether that actually happens remains to be seen. What is certain is that his removal has unleashed intense speculation about what is really driving this purge and how it fits into the broader corruption scandal that has been unfolding in Ukraine for weeks. That scandal first became visible when Zelensky's friend Timer Mindik, who appears to have played a central, if perhaps not pivotal role in corrupt schemes, fled the country and is widely believed to be in Israel. Since then, multiple recordings have circulated, apparently capturing senior Ukrainian officials and their associates talking with chilling cynicism about how best to siphon off Western money and enrich themselves. Anyone following independent outlets has long understood that this level of corruption was endemic in Ukraine. The surprise for many in the West is not that it exists, but that NABU and SAPO agencies, which for years appeared incapable of producing a single meaningful conviction, have suddenly sprung to life and launched serious investigations. For many inside Ukraine, the shock is not the existence of corruption. Few there can plausibly pretend this is new, but the fact that these agencies are finally acting, however selectively, against powerful figures. Yet almost no one in Ukraine takes this revival at face value. The widespread assumption is that the agencies are serving some political agenda. That pervasive cynicism is entirely understandable. The reality is that corruption has permeated Ukraine's political system from top to bottom for decades. The pre-Maidan government of Viktor Yanukovych was notoriously corrupt, as was his entourage. And systemic corruption dates back to the early post-Soviet period, if not earlier. My own strong view is that corruption worsened significantly after the 2014 Maidan coup or revolution, when the collapse of the Yanukovych government led to an institutional breakdown, including in law enforcement, just as Western money began to flow into the country on a far greater scale. Once the war escalated in February 2022 and Western financial support multiplied, the incentives and opportunities for large-scale theft became stratospheric. It is therefore implausible to treat the Yermach affair as a simple law enforcement move. There is almost certainly a power play underway. Many observers argued that the United States has long been tired of Yermach. Politico published an article months ago suggesting Washington wanted him gone, and there have been repeated reports that U.S. officials tried to persuade Zelensky to remove him. That does not, however, automatically mean that Washington orchestrated this particular operation. Several factors complicate that narrative. Since USAID's closure in its previous form earlier this year, NABU and SAPO have been funded primarily by the European Union, not the United States, which weakens direct American control. Moreover, American influence over these bodies has historically been exercised through the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, which is itself in flux. The long-serving, staunchly pro-Zelensky ambassador has resigned, and there is significant turnover and uncertainty regarding the embassy's role under the Trump administration. If the United States did apply pressure on NABU and SAPO to move against Yermach, that pressure was unlikely to be triggered merely by a boilerplate interview in the Atlantic. The more plausible trigger would be the announcement that Yermach was to lead a Ukrainian delegation to Miami to meet Witko and Kushner ahead of their planned trip to Moscow and their meetings with Russian officials, including President Putin. Yermach has long been regarded by many in Washington as an obstacle to any serious settlement with Russia, and as a man whose close ties to European leaders have made him an unreliable interlocutor. The prospect of this figure heading a crucial delegation at a decisive moment in the diplomacy would have been unwelcome to those in the United States pushing for a negotiated outcome. At the same time, it is far from clear that Washington alone, or even primarily, was behind the move. The European Union, despite paying for NABU and SAPO, had explicitly signaled that it did not want the corruption investigations escalated at this moment. EU ambassadors anxious about instability in Kiev while Russia advances and the Trump administration pushes a settlement that cuts across their preferences, reportedly called on Kiev to put the investigations on hold. After Yermach's resignation became public, Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski publicly described the development as bad news for Ukraine and, by extension, for the EU. There are likewise Ukrainian voices aligned with Brussels, arguing that fighting corruption can wait, whereas winning the war cannot, a euphemism for letting Zelensky, Yermach, and their circle continue their work, which critics would describe as looting the country. This points to an overlooked reality. There is already a deep political crisis unfolding inside Ukraine that has its own internal logic and actors. The dissident Ukrainian outlet Strana, now operating from exile, has produced some of the most illuminating analysis of this crisis. It characterizes Yermach as a key pillar of Zelensky's vertical of power, the structure through which the presidency exerts control over the state apparatus. By forcing him out, NABU has not only removed a powerful operator, but has also delivered a symbolic blow to Zelensky himself, demonstrating that even the president's closest associates can no longer rely on his protection. According to Strana, this sends a signal throughout the Ukrainian elite. Zelensky is no longer the uncontested source of authority and cannot guarantee immunity even to those at the very core of his circle. Few in Kiev seriously believe that Yermach and Timur Mindich could have orchestrated their schemes without Zelensky's knowledge or tacit consent. In that environment, a blow to Yermach is widely read as a blow to Zelensky, a sign that he too could be accused of corruption at any moment if subordinates begin to cooperate with investigators to save themselves. The likelihood of that happening has now increased. The article also notes that Zelensky's grip on the machinery of government has been weakening since the scandal first broke. Prime Minister Shmyhal, a protege of Yermach, has increasingly leaned on the parliamentary servant of the people faction rather than the presidential office, while the SBU, Ukraine's main security and intelligence service, and the Prosecutor General's office have begun to quietly sabotage certain political directives coming from Zelensky's team. Yermach's fall will almost certainly accelerate this process. The key question is no longer whether Zelensky will lose power, but how. Whether his authority will simply be hollowed out while he remains nominally in office, or whether he will be pushed out entirely. That brings us to David Arakhamia, leader of the Servant of the People faction in Parliament and a longtime rival of Yermach. Arakhamia, a Georgian by origin who has lived most of his adult life in Ukraine and is fully absorbed into its political world, has in the past been close to Zelensky. He headed the Ukrainian delegation in the 2022 Istanbul talks with Russia that produced a draft peace agreement. Yet he has also been widely seen as competing with Yermach for influence over Zelensky and the broader system. It is entirely plausible that Arakami and his allies have played a role in channeling pressure through Nebu and Sapo against Yermach, though this remains speculative. Petro Poroshenko, Kiev Mayor Klitschko, and other long-standing opponents of Zelensky are also likely to see this crisis as an opportunity to weaken or displace him. Even figures in comfortable exile, such as those serving as ambassadors abroad, may still be maneuvering from afar. Kiev increasingly looks less like a functioning capital and more like a snake pit of competing factions. All of these players have agency. They have networks inside Nebu, Sapo, and other institutions. It is not necessary to invoke a direct American order to explain Yermach's downfall. Domestic rivals could easily have harnessed Western-created anti-corruption tools for their own purposes. What matters is the broader context, the unraveling of the Zelensky regime itself. After Witko and Kushner unveiled their 28-point plan for ending the war, there was a brief moment of stabilization in Kiev. The plan shocked the Ukrainian leadership. No one in Kiev wanted it implemented. The European Union was equally alarmed and urged its Ukrainian partners to hold the line and avoid provocations while Russia advanced and Washington pursued a settlement that Brussels opposes. During that window, Zelensky managed to hold off immediate challenges, and no alternative figure emerged ready to replace him. That moment has now passed. Yermach's fall is one symptom of a larger crisis. It coincides with rising anxiety over the sustainability of Western financial support. A recent Financial Times article revealed that Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo has effectively torpedoed the flagship EU plan, championed by Ursula von der Leyen and Olaf Scholz, to fund a €140 billion loan to Ukraine using frozen Russian central bank assets held at Euroclear as collateral. De Croo, citing Euroclear's own leadership, warned that the scheme is legally dubious and could collapse in court with catastrophic consequences for the clearinghouse. In his letter, as reported, De Croo argues that rushing the proposal through could undermine prospects for a peace deal, shorthand for provoking Donald Trump, who would likely blame Europe for sabotaging his peace initiative with Moscow. More concretely, he demands that EU member states provide Euroclear with legally binding, unconditional, irrevocable, on-demand, joint and several guarantees for the roughly €185 billion in Russian assets it holds. Under such an arrangement, any EU state could be required to pay the full amount if Euroclear lost a case and the assets were no longer available, leaving that state to recover contributions from its partners afterwards. It is widely assumed that Germany would be first in the firing line. This demand is extraordinary. It effectively asks Germany and other EU states to sign a blank check in a scheme that Euroclear itself appears to consider legally unsound. The message is clear. Euroclear and Belgium are unwilling to bear the risk, and they expect that any serious legal challenge, quite possibly in Asian rather than European courts, would end in defeat. In those circumstances, it is hard to see how the plan can go forward if the loan does not materialize. And if other channels of financial support are also faltering, Kiev faces the prospect of dwindling European money at the very moment when the United States is signaling that the war is lost and that it cannot indefinitely rescue Ukraine from the consequences. People in Kiev are surely aware of this. Political and financial elites there read the Financial Times and have contacts in Brussels and other capitals. They will have heard that Euroclear and the Belgians are digging in, that legal obstacles are formidable, and that the scheme to conjure €140 billion out of frozen Russian assets may never see the light of day. Against that background, the panic in Kiev becomes easier to understand. If the Russians are advancing, if the Americans are privately acknowledging that Ukraine is lost, and if the Europeans are balking at further massive commitments, then the political class in Kiev will draw the logical conclusions. The walls are closing in. Under those conditions, it is not surprising that some might say, this is the moment to strike. For some, That may mean trying to replace Zelensky with a figure like Poroshenko, who maintains good personal relationships with European leaders and might be seen in Brussels as a more reliable partner for continued funding. For others, it may mean cutting Zelensky down to size, limiting his authority while preserving him as a nominal figurehead to maintain a veneer of continuity. For still others, it may simply mean looting as much as possible before the collapse, stuffing suitcases with cash in preparation for flight in February, March, May, or June. In that sense, the Yermach scandal looks less like a moral cleansing and more like an elite struggle in the final stages of a failing regime. None of this would be happening if Ukraine were not facing a catastrophic situation on the battlefield and in its finances. The political convulsions in Kiev are symptoms, not causes. The front lines appear to be weeks or months from potential collapse. The United States is openly voicing doubts about Ukraine's prospects. European governments are under growing internal pressure from their own economic problems and societies weary of endless commitments. The underlying driver of all these shifts is the steady advance of Russian forces and the attrition of Ukraine's military. Diplomacy is now running hard to catch up with these realities. Reports suggest that the United States has essentially cut the Europeans out of the core talks with Russia. There was a meeting in Geneva, but Washington is said to have decided to stick closely to the main concessions already floated: Ukrainian withdrawal from Donbass, formal acceptance that Ukraine will remain outside NATO, and eventual recognition of Russia's sovereignty over the 4 newly incorporated regions plus Crimea. These points, American officials understand, are not optional. They reflect understandings reached in prior discussions with Moscow, including the Anchorage meeting at which Trump and Putin reportedly settled key outlines. If Washington tried to walk them back now, the Russians would simply refuse to negotiate further, insisting that they will win their objectives on the battlefield instead. This helps explain the fury in Europe. Leaders such as Estonia's Kaja Kallas have taken to making sweeping claims about Russian aggression over the last century, sometimes in ways that are historically bizarre. Such rhetoric, echoed in mainstream outlets, reflects the emotional and political shock in European capitals at being sidelined in decisions that will directly affect their security architecture. But from Washington's point of view, and as analysts like Anatol Lieven have argued, European governments have become too hysterical and maximalist to be constructive partners in negotiations. Their inclusion would only empower the most hardline positions and obstruct any realistic settlement. On the Russian side, the emerging plan appears to be to convert the current points for discussion into a structured negotiation between properly constituted delegations. Moscow has signaled that it wants talks not only with Kiev, but directly with Washington. Foreign Minister Lavrov and veteran aides like Medinsky and Ushakov are likely to be central to the Russian team. Istanbul is the obvious candidate for a venue. Given Turkey's previous role hosting talks between Russia and Ukraine, and the recent reported visit to Turkey by Sergei Narishkin, head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, which may have included discussions with President Erdogan about that very possibility. Once such negotiations might have been hosted in a European capital like Helsinki or Geneva. Today, given Europe's posture, Turkey or perhaps Budapest are more plausible. Meanwhile, military developments continue to push events towards a decisive phase. There are reports that 2 tankers sailing under African flags and heading to the Russian port of Novorossiysk suffered serious damage in the Black Sea, possibly with one sinking. While Western media attribute this to drifting mines, many of which were laid by Ukraine early in the war, Russian sources suggest that the tankers may have been attacked by Ukrainian maritime drones launched from accompanying boats. If that is true, it would constitute a deliberate attack on civilian shipping on the high seas, raising questions of piracy and threatening to escalate the conflict sharply, particularly if it is interpreted as an attempt to impose a de facto blockade on Russian oil exports via the Black Sea. Such a step would almost certainly provoke a strong Russian response and further erode Ukraine's support in much of the global south. At the same time, Russia has conducted another major combined missile and drone strike on Kiev, reportedly one of the largest to date, targeting defense industrial and energy infrastructure. Visual evidence shows multiple impacts across the capital, although comprehensive assessments of the damage are still pending. Notably, The available footage shows little sign of effective Ukrainian air defense activity during this particular wave, though fuller information will only emerge over time. On the ground, Russian forces continue to advance in multiple sectors. There is particular alarm about the situation in Huliaipol, where one Ukrainian brigade is reported to have collapsed, with soldiers fleeing first from outlying villages and then from the town itself. Attempts to plug the gap by rushing in more experienced units seem to have been hampered by Russian numerical superiority, and fighting is said to have reached the center of the town, with its complete capture potentially only days away. Similar collapses have occurred before in Vuhledar, Novohordivka, and earlier in Lyman, but were previously more isolated episodes. If Huliaipol's fall heralds a broader pattern at a time when Ukrainian reserves are exhausted, the consequences could be dramatic. Russian officials and media are also highlighting operations around other critical points, such as the Pokrovsk area and the renewed pressures around Lyman and Seversk, suggesting preparations for encirclements and further local collapses. As with earlier phases of the war, when the Russian Defense Ministry began releasing detailed soldier interviews from near Avdiivka, such messaging often precedes or accompanies decisive pushes. Taken together, these military, financial, and political trends converge on a single reality. Ukraine's position is deteriorating rapidly. The panic in Kiev, the desperate elite power plays, the collapsing schemes in Brussels to fund Ukraine with Russian assets, the American scramble to lock in a deal with Moscow before the front entirely implodes. These are all different facets of the same picture. The Zelensky government, which only months ago still looked entrenched enough that no serious alternative stepped forward when Washington quietly sounded out potential replacements, now appears vulnerable. Its internal cohesion is fraying. Its key fixer, Yermach, has been toppled. Its foreign backers are divided and fatigued. The end state is not yet predetermined. Negotiations between the United States and Russia, if they are formally launched, will likely be complex, protracted, and fraught. The internal dynamics in Kiev could take many forms: a controlled reduction of Zelensky's powers, a messy internal coup, or a chaotic collapse in which no single authority retains enough legitimacy or capacity to negotiate on behalf of the state. In that latter scenario, there may quite literally be no one left with the authority or the political base to sign and implement any agreement. That is a possibility Strana and other observers now openly consider from Moscow's perspective. The remaining question is strategic: whether to accept a settlement that leaves some truncated Ukrainian state west of the Dnipro as a neutral buffer, or to conclude that only a more complete military solution satisfies Russia's security concerns, especially if any Ukrainian remnant is seen as an unstable, hostile entity controlled by external powers. The course of the fighting over the coming months and the outcome of the U.S.-Russian talks will go a long way toward answering that question. What can be said with some confidence is that the crisis in Kiev, symbolized so vividly by Yermach's fall, is a late-stage phenomenon. It is what internal politics tends to look like in capitals that sense defeat approaching, a frenzy of intrigue, score settling, and looting at the center as the outer defenses buckle. The frontline advances of Russian forces, the drawing up or radical reconfiguration of Western financial support, and the unraveling of political authority in Kiev are not separate stories. They are different expressions of the same underlying reality: a war whose outcome is increasingly clear, and a system that is struggling and perhaps failing to manage its own collapse.